Yes, 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 and it's happening again, and most people don't even see it yet. Currently, with Bitcoin, we are not only in a pretty good position, no, we've also broken through certain zones where it's slowly becoming bullish again. The sentiment is slowly changing direction. In terms of liquidity, everything still looks good so far. However, I could imagine that in the next few days we might dip again to $92,000, $93,000 and pick up a bit more money here. Otherwise, we don't have much liquidity down here anymore. It could slowly be that we are seeing the breakout now. At least from a chart technical perspective, it looks good so far. Every time we found resistance at the 200 moving average here, we saw a significant bounce upwards, and now it could be the same again. Nevertheless, we are still just in the neutral zone, and people are still fearful. This is mainly because many are still expecting a recession this year, and we simply need to look at certain points. The gross domestic product in the first quarter of this year was negative. Accordingly, the risk of recession has increased a bit. However, what must be said now is that according to current estimates, we have a GDP of 1.1% for the second quarter. So here we see an increase again. We can also see that we have risen again here. Very, very important, because we would officially have a recession if we had negative growth in 2 consecutive quarters. Currently, it doesn't look like that, which means we won't be entering a recession. Just as the core inflation rate in the USA is also slowly starting to drop. We are getting closer and closer to the Fed's target. The goal is to achieve that 2% inflation, and you see we are getting closer and closer. That means if that happens, money printing will slowly begin, and that would be the best for our markets. We want fresh capital here again, but we don't want a recession. That would be fatal here, and even worse. We now know that this year we will see several interest rate cuts, and interest rate cuts will bring fresh capital back into the markets. We also know that the Fed balance sheet is continuously flattening and is slowly signaling a trend reversal, so that we will see a monetary expansion here again. If we see a monetary expansion, the US dollar would also fall further. The lower it falls, the more risk tolerant investors become here. This is very important because something interesting has just happened with the US dollar. We have broken through the value of 100 with the US dollar, and every time this has happened in the past, the dollar became even weaker and we had the bull run. Exactly during these phases, we had the bull run, the altcoin season. Currently, we are again at the same point, where the dollar breaks through the value of 100 and continues to weaken, and thus we could also see this bull run plus the altcoin season. This is further reinforced if we see monetary expansion in the near future. And it is truly interesting how identically the US dollar behaves whether a Democrat or a Republican is president. The first time when Trump was president, he temporarily strengthened the dollar, but made it weak in the long term. That is exactly the case right now as well. It's happening again in the same way. With Joe Biden or Obama, it was the other way around. They initially strengthened the dollar further. However, if this continues, the dollar will remain weakened in the coming weeks and months because we are also seeing monetary expansion and so on. And that's very good because, as mentioned, the more money we have for risk assets, the more risk tolerant the investors are here. That's exactly what we want to see. We have now finally broken through extremely important zones for both Bitcoin and Ethereum. Look at this resistance zone. We tested it 5 times, maybe even briefly went above it, but each time it pushed us down. Now in the last few days, we've had a proper breakout here. This is no coincidence. The same goes for Ethereum. Look at this. Tested it all the time, 4 times in a row, and now we've had a proper breakthrough here. This is very positive, and it also suggests to me that this was indeed a sustainable breakthrough, and not something short-term. Here with Ethereum, it naturally depends on how things progress. However, it would be important for Ethereum to slowly start and begin to outperform more Bitcoin. That would definitely be nice. Then one could slowly start talking about an altcoin season. Actually, it looks like it can't go lower in relation, but you never know. But fundamentally, we are really at very interesting points with both Bitcoin and Ethereum at the moment. Just like with Bitcoin dominance. Here, we have been building up all this time, continuing to build up, but it looks like we are getting closer and closer to the upper resistance zone, and from there, as in the past, we would likely break downwards. And from there, we would actually tend to fall. And when we then fall, it will be interesting if we also break through this zone here. It looks like a rising wedge, at least from a chart's technical perspective. And I also think that Bitcoin dominance cannot go much, much higher. Sure, it can go higher, but I think we've seen the majority of growth here. I believe 1, 2, 3% more is possible, but much, much more shouldn't be in the cards simply because of these resistance zones. And then it just depends on when the money is printed and how risk averse we become with the US dollar. These two things will become extremely interesting again. These two factors will ensure that especially the altcoin sector will be performing really well. And this is also very interesting because the S&P 500 has recently corrected significantly, but in this correction, we have already worked our way up over 50% just based on the correction alone. And that's really nice because every time in the past, except for 2022, it was the case that we didn't establish a new low afterwards. And historically, May has actually been a good month for Ethereum. I am very curious about the next 1 or 2 months for Ethereum because, as mentioned, we have seen a nice breakout here. It really only depends on how we perform with Ethereum compared to Bitcoin. This really triggers that last phase of euphoria in the altcoins. And Michael Saylor continues to buy, as he announced yesterday. I'm curious to see if the figures will be released today or tomorrow, showing how much he has bought again. But he also wanted to raise $80 billion here. And this money will flow into Bitcoin one way or another. This could give us another push, perhaps even the next push towards 120, that's $30,000. And with that, he could also initiate this altcoin season. As I said, I'm not declaring an altcoin season here. I rather expect that it will stretch out a bit more, but there are currently some figures and data that don't look too bad for the coming months. Slowly, this foundation is building up better and better. Because I mean, even in the past, when everyone knew we were in a recession, that's exactly when things tended to go up. Because not everyone can be right again. Most of the time, we had already expanded our reserves before the recession, and it's very important to understand. Even if a recession comes, it's just scaremongering, because from that point on, fresh money is printed. The recession we had here in 2020 during the Corona crash was, of course, quite severe. We corrected by nearly 50%. It was tough, fell very sharply, but let's zoom out. You know exactly what happened there. From that exact point, they started printing money like crazy. Because of this recession, because of the Corona crash, we fell sharply, but money was printed in abundance. We didn't immediately go crazy with Bitcoin. It is actually a bit delayed here as well, because we always have a few months delay with global liquidity. But after that, we had a huge breakout with Bitcoin and global liquidity. So in the long term, a recession is not a big deal and just a short correction. It could be that this was just a small mini recession here and that we can now rise sensibly again. Because a real recession, according to numbers, data, and facts, should not be seen. I have already shown you that the preliminary estimate for the next inflation figures is positive again. We do not see negative growth, but rather positive growth, and accordingly, it is not a recession. This crash alone was nearly 32%. We had exactly such crashes every time in the past cycles. Here, this is completely normal. On the way to the bull market top, we often have 30% corrections. They are just as much a part of it. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and a comment on the video. It definitely helps me.